Power Supply Advisory Team session, and I want to thank the PSAT members for your participation and for your engagement and input. I think the process is going very, very well. I want to thank you for that. I also want to say welcome to those of you from the public that have joined us today. We're glad to have you here. First of all, let me talk a minute, quick safety review in the event that we have to evacuate because of an issue here. As you all know, most of you came in the doorway here to my right. That certainly is an exit to the parking lot. There are other doorways straight behind the table and out those two doors that you can actually exit the building. Restrooms are also out that door to the right and on the left in the event that you need to do that. We could shelter in place, I believe, here in this room if we needed to do that. But again, thank you for being here. I want to mention a couple of quick things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Siemens for the remainder of the meeting. One of the things I want to mention is you may notice if you're at your seat there is a notebook. We did get your feedback, and we have provided the notebooks to have everything that we've covered so far. It's also online. You may take these with you. These are yours to keep, and we will actually probably start a second volume after this meeting, so that book won't get any bigger. It's just that we want to make sure that you all had the information that you might want to refer to. It's a little bit easier to refer to this during the meeting if you have to, if you got a question about something that we covered. There are tabs, and I want to say thanks to Gail Carson's team for pulling this together. They did a great job, I think, in getting all the information sort of sectionalized so that you could also see what's going on there, so thanks to them for that. One other quick housekeeping reminder, if you'll notice on the agenda, there are going to be breakout groups, much like before if you were here at the last meeting. We did have a couple of breakout groups. I think we're going to do something similar today. Certainly the breakout groups are designed for the PSAT members, but I want to make sure that folks that are here, members of the public, you're welcome to attend the breakout groups as well, space permitting, just with the understanding that those breakout groups are for the interaction between the facilitator and the PSAT members. So I would encourage the public to be there as observers. You're welcome to mill around and go back and forth, listen, take pictures, whatever you want to do. So you're welcome to be a part of that. I want to make sure everybody is aware of that, okay? We're going to actually kick it off. I'm going to ask Gary and Nelson, Gary Vacinas and Nelson Bacaleo, they're from Siemens, they're going to be facilitating this. We're going to do a brief overview of a community meeting that we had that was held after the last PSAT committee meeting. And so we're going to have a brief overview of that, as well as a brief overview for those of you who were not here that will cover the actual outcomes from the last PSAT meeting. So thank you again for your involvement. I want to make sure that you know that we really, really do value that, and we want to continue that. I know some of you may have to scoot before we're done at 2. There's a lot on the agenda. Be sure again, as a reminder, take your book with you if you have to leave, whenever you do decide to leave. But again, I want to thank you for your participation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gary from Siemens.
Thank you, JT, and good morning, everybody. For those of you who were not here last time, I'll introduce myself and my two colleagues here in a moment just to get started. My name is Gary Vacinas. I'm the project director for this project. I have about 44 years of experience in the energy business, working first with a utility and then after that as a consultant to utilities and a lot of planning directives. And we've conducted a large number of integrated resource plans over the years, of which this will be one of about 10 we're doing this year, actually. So a little bit on the agenda. I'll also introduce Nelson Bacalao and John Dew. Each of us are going to take some turns today, so you get to hear from all three of us as we go through the agenda. We're going to start with Nelson is going to describe some of the outcomes of the last PSAT meeting as well as the community stakeholder meeting. While this is your 5th meeting, this is our 2nd, and I know that not all of you were here for the first meeting, so we're going to do a little bit of a summary of that meeting. That meeting was primarily focused on methodology and approach. And I kind of characterize it as peeling an onion. We start high level, and then we dig a little deeper each time we go through. Today, if you look at the overall agenda, you're going to see that we're going to start with that high level discussion, but we're going to get a lot more into the details today. We're going to give you a fair amount of information on how we're developing the inputs to the analysis. We're going to build off of the discussions we had with you last time with regard to the scenarios. We took some of the input that we got from you in terms of the potential for additional scenarios and sensitivities. We're going to go through those again today. We're going to look at the inputs to the analysis, the key inputs, which include base case values or most likely values that we would be selecting, but also how we characterize the uncertainties in those inputs for both scenarios. And also, we will be looking at what we characterize as distributions, meaning a range of outcomes that each of the key variables will have. So we're going to be talking about the scenarios. We'll also talk about the supply inputs or the supply options, which will look at different technologies that will be evaluated in each of these evaluations. And we'll provide you with some of the detail on what those input assumptions may be so that you get an idea for not only what those costs look like today, but how they may look in the future and what some of the uncertainties are in that characteristic as well. And we'll talk a little bit about transmission options. That's obviously very critical for evaluating not only the TVA option, but also the alternatives in terms of entering the market and potentially building resources yourselves. And then we're going to have some breakout sessions where, again, we'll ask for your input into what you've seen today, what you didn't see that you thought should be considered, and how comfortable you are with the ranges of input assumptions that we're pulling together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nelson Bacalao, and he's going to talk a little bit about what we covered in the last PSAT meeting and in the one community meeting that we had several weeks ago. Nelson?
Good morning, Nelson Bacalao, Consulting Manager, Houston. Have over 40 years of experience and been working the last 5 years or more on different IRP processes, including one very challenging in Puerto Rico. And I think my overall experience both in transmission originally and then generation and IRP is going to be my key contribution to this process. So let me start with a recap of the community engagement meeting that was held on August the 20th. During that meeting, we conducted something very similar to what we did with the meeting that we had with the PSAT. We went over the IRP. It means what's an IRP, what are the recommendations that it's expected to produce, the answers that it's expected to provide, the objectives that will be considered in producing those answers, and the overall process. The customers that attended the meeting, the community that attended the meeting, were asked to answer a group of questions and basically to rank them. We were wanting to get from the community their views on what was important. And we didn't receive that many answers, but however, of the ones that we did receive, reliability was ranked the most important for those who answered. Then affordability, resiliency, and sustainability. Being 10, the highest value that you could get, reliability got 5.9. So the people that answered were very concerned about reliability. However, with this view, we said, well, there should be another way of capturing what's behind people's minds. And the other was looking at their questions. There were a large number of questions put by the audience, and what we did here is to catalog them in what they were concerned about. Looking at their questions, what was behind it. And there were questions on affordability, basically all the topics that relate to, okay, will my bill go up? Will things be more expensive? Then there were a number of questions regarding sustainability and environment, basically related issues like the aquifer will be protected, how will underground, in general transmission will be routed, but is underground considered? And then questions regarding energy efficiency, solar, DG, distributed generation, all of these questions that relate with affordability. Then there were a number of questions regarding the supply options, basically how the TVA contract is going to work. If you go out, what's going to happen? How interconnections are going to be taken into consideration. We'll be building new transmission to interconnect with MISO. The reliability, basically anything related with will the lights stay on, and in general the process. There were questions here on how the IRP was put in place, and even questions what's a PSAT. So looking at that, then we get a slightly different view, which is also in line with our discussions with the PSAT. Affordability now became the most important, followed by sustainability, and then the next ones were supply options, which in a way relates to the topic of the engagement meeting, and then reliability and MLGW in general. So for the community, was very much aligned with what we had in our PSAT meeting. With that, now for those of you that could not make it to our original PSAT, just going to make a brief summary, and we also prepared a document that summarizes all of the questions received and the discussions had, and this document is going to be posted on the website. If you recall, during that meeting, we did a process very similar to this. We went over the IRP as Gary described, and at the end we posed several questions. Basically, what additions would you make to the objective and matrix? What changes would you make to the strategies considered? And whether there were other scenarios than those that we considered, or how would you rank our scenarios? As you will be seeing today, we took into account all of these recommendations and discussions, and in particular, for example, for objectives, economic and rate impact came up as very important. How will the IRP foster the economy, the Memphis economy? Will it have an impact on the rates to the customers? Will it be reliable and resilient? Will improve to the situation that we have today? How will it prepare us to the effects of potential climate change? Sustainability. And here most of the responses were, I will very much the ones that we saw from the community engagement will be impacts on the aquifer. Will their impact of the transmission lines going through neighborhoods. So that is also taken into account, as we'll be seeing, and rate stability. So those were with respect of the objectives, and we'll be seeing next what we proposed. On strategies, we discussed our four basic strategies, and from the supply, it's a very important component of the strategy. And during our discussion also, you remember that the strategies that we maybe should start from there. The strategies were MISO going to well, status quo, which is staying with TVA, going to MISO for all of their resources, to the self-supply, and then a strategy that was a mixture of MISO and self-supply. And during our discussion, another strategy came up, which is the all of the above, basically taking the best of the different options, partial from TVA, partial from MISO, partial from self-supply. So that's also being considered. Finally, with respect to the scenario, we'll be seeing that during the discussion, several scenarios were recommended, and we'll be discussing them today. In particular, you'll see the new inflation case that is proposed to be included, the worst snapshot, which is just going back in history, pick the worst materialization on a variable, let's say gas prices, and see how the portfolios behave. By portfolio, I mean a mix of generation used to supply the city. MISO operational changes, and one very important that you see that we call you call it climate crisis. So that's a summary of that meeting, and as I mentioned, there is this document that will be posted on the website. With that, then let me go to the objectives and metrics. And this is what will be used to measure the IRP. And as you see, the first objective is going to be affordability. And the way we're going to be measuring it is as we produce the different expansion plans or portfolios. They have cost over time, capital, and operational maintenance and fuel. So the first one is the net present value of the revenue requirement, how much it costs to produce the energy. But complementary to it, also we looked at the average rate. What is the total cost in dollars per megawatt hour? Because there are some plants that may have the lowest NPV, but may have initially very high impact in dollars per megawatt hour. So that's how we measure the affordability. Other impact is the reliability and resource adequacy. Is how reliable and how adequate is the resource mix and the transmission system to supply the load. And we have classical.
Hey Nelson, I'm sorry. Could you, excuse me, this is JT. Nelson, right here. Real quick, could you back up a minute under affordability and just kind of explain the notion of revenue requirements and what that means?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, we call revenue requirements basically what the customer at the end of the day has to pay for our resource. Let's speak, for example, solar power plant. The owner, whether the city or a private who install it, needs to recuperate its investment, plus its operating and maintenance costs. So what we do here is we convert those investments into a payment that happens every year for the life of the project. That's a revenue requirement, how much money the city or the developer needs to collect to cover its investment plus operating and costs. So it's very much related with the cost of service. So, and that's why the present value of the revenue requirement is a very important component. The other, as I mentioned, is the rate. Like some plants that are heavier on thermal options and fuel costs may have higher revenue requirements initially, and then as photovoltaics come in and they phase out, higher revenue requirements, and it's the other way around. They would have higher impact in the rates because you have the fuel component. As you start phasing those out and you have more renewables, you have less impact on the rate, but maybe more impact on the revenue requirements because of the capital cost. So those variables, although they can be correlated, need to be tracked separately. Dollars per megawatt hour and revenue requirement. That. Clear? Yeah. Okay. So we mentioned reliability. We looked at the loss of the load is the probability of not being able to meet the peak load on a given year. The standard in the US is 0.1, or once every 10 years we won't be able to meet the peak load. So that's one parameter that we use to evaluate the resource adequacy. And then we also measure the energy not served. If there is something happening either at the generation level or at the transmission level, will there be some load not being served? And then how much of that energy? So that's another measure. And finally, load shedding. When you have extreme transmission events, 2 or more lines going out, you may have some load shedding. So that's another parameter that we use to evaluate the reliability. Other parameter is the price risk, and that's really the stability. A plan that tends to have the rates more stable is preferred than a plan that has very high rates at the beginning and then drop. So this one sees the stability. Also, a plan that is, again, going to my example, a price that is heavily dependent on gas prices may have a higher impact on the dollars per megawatt hour just because of the volatility on the gas prices. Environmental risk minimization. Here we're looking at the key effluents being CO2, one of the most important, and we measured in both in absolute quantities and rates. How many metric tons per megawatt hours are produced? And again, the objective is to see how those decline over time. Market. This is related when we go to purchases in, for example, in MICE. Basically, the volatility of buying in the spot market. When we go to a market, there are 2 elements that we try to balance. One is the spot purchases that will benefit us from depressed prices during certain periods, but we have the risk of high prices, high spikes in prices, or bilateral contracts that give us stability, but then we will not benefit from low prices, particularly. So here we measure that risk as a band, as a percentage, to be decided of volatility on the prices. Local impact, this again goes to economic development and its number of jobs created. And finally, we have resiliency, which is also measured as energy not served, but it's different. In this case, we evaluate the system, how it would stay after a major event. If a major storm goes through the area, how is the system likely to be after the event, and how long it would take to go back to normal. And given that condition, we evaluate how much energy is likely not to be served. And different plants operate in different ways. So these are the overall objectives and the metrics that we'll be using to assess. With that, I'll leave Gary covering the scenarios.
Let me ask if there are any questions with regard to any of the material that we've covered thus far. Yes?
Go back to that other slide, please.
This one?
Yes.
Sure. Yes.
Also related to jobs, do you estimate a wage rate for those jobs? And also, do you estimate sort of the number of big businesses or collection of jobs that come all at once because the community becomes much more attractive to those that want to move to a clean city that has clean energy? It's not just one job or two jobs, it might be 50 jobs.
That's great. That's a great question. Typically, when we've looked at the economic impact, it's been more on the direct impact, which has to do with if you're building plants in the area, kinds of things that are direct. The other economic impact is more indirect, which is if you are more sustainable, will you attract businesses to the area? And we can potentially, if there are some studies that we could draw on to try and get some of the reference to the indirect impacts associated with stability, with sustainability, we could potentially look at that. But initially, our thought is more of the direct rather than the indirect. But if there are some thoughts that you have with regard to where we might draw on some of those indirect impacts, that would be useful. Yeah, go ahead.
And on the same area of the direct impact, there is the effect on affordability. As the affordability increases, then you may attract further businesses that will take advantage of that. So that's another way that we see the impact on the economy and job creation.
Referring to the load shed, the 20-year trajectory, are we considering global warming? Because think about now how it is in September. We think, the summer months will be the extreme months. But now you have to consider even into October, the high temperature.
That's an excellent question because that's there exactly because of that. Because of the more frequent, more severe storms, that resilience, which is now the buzzword in our industry, becomes so important. And when I mentioned that we would assess how the system would behave after a major event, I had exactly climate change in mind when I said that. And you'll see when we're talking about the scenarios, you'll see the game.
That's the other point is that I think last time one of your recommendations actually was to look at a more severe weather scenario. And so that's next on the agenda, so we'll be covering that as well. Any other, yes?
I'm an engineer by way of background. I was in charge of forecasting at FedEx at one point in time. The salespeople were all, the engineer in me always wanted to quantify everything, and you're trying real hard to do that up there. But there's also these qualitative things that the salespeople are always pushing.
Yes.
We can get this customer, or we can, expand in this area, or, if we have, a larger plane flying in the Midland, Odessa, I was there when the Permian Basin was really growing many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things, the city of Memphis needs, all of those, more qualitative sort of things. Maybe it's just a check mark or a plus or a double plus or something if it's a really strong sense.
It's a great point. And I would encourage, if you have notes, want to put notes down on a piece of paper, or if you want to raise them in our meetings, because when we do the breakout sessions, we'll be asking about these things again in terms of, are there things missing? Are there some qualitative factors that ought to be considered? At the end of the day, when we're looking at these different objectives, we're going to try and put together some rankings on each of the metrics. And so ultimately, it is going to be somewhat subjective in terms of how you weight these different variables. But if you think that there are variables that are not on here, that may be more qualitative, but that we should add, please get them to us, and we'll make sure that that list is at least covered in a qualitative measure. You're right, we try and quantify wherever we can, but I think there are certain elements that can't be quantified, and we should still consider them if they're important to all of your customers. Yes. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So the next thing we're going to turn as I recall, this list was looked at by the PSAT committee last time, and it was considered to be a fairly comprehensive list. So if there are ones to add, please let us know. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about scenarios. And this is a very complex slide, but I'm going to break it down into individual pieces, so don't pay too close attention to all the detail on here. You recall that Nelson mentioned that there are 4 strategies that we're going to be looking at least possibly 5 in terms of the total combinations. So we'll be looking at the TVA option, which is to be remain a full requirements customer of TVA. We'll look at potentially purchasing all of your requirements from the MISO market. We will look at building some and potentially self-supplying your needs. And the 4th strategy is a combination of the MISO market and building. And the 5th one was actually a combination of all 3, as Nelson pointed out, which is the possibility that TVA may consider a partial requirements contract in the future. So those are the 5 strategies. So you have to evaluate those strategies against alternatives. And so we start with the concept of scenarios to develop what we would characterize as plausible boundary conditions for what might happen in the future, beyond your best guess. Best guess is kind of the base case. And we start with a base case forecast, and we'll show you some of the input assumptions that will go into the base case. The problem with a base case forecast, or any base case forecast, or reference case forecast, is that everybody knows it's going to be wrong. So if that's the case, then you have to consider not only making a bet on your best guess, but you actually have to consider a range of uncertainty around those features. And so what we do is we construct different scenarios, and we will run our capacity expansion model, which will look at each of those strategies, and maybe in a couple of different ways. But we'll look at each of those strategies with regard to different future outcomes. And we constructed some, and we talked about 3 of those the last time, which are the 3 that are on the left: the base case, the high technology, and the high regulatory scenarios. And I'm going to go through each one of those individually, so I'm not going to focus too much on each of those variables at the moment. But you sort of see that the base case, whether you're talking about CO2 prices or gas prices, the economy, load forecast, coal prices, storage, renewable cost, and actually the cost of all various technologies and energy efficiency, those variables can change associated with each one of those future scenarios. So what we start doing is we basically will define each case, and then we'll run a least cost capacity expansion with each of those four or 5 strategies, and we'll determine what under each of those cases would be the lowest cost portfolio or mix of assets, and see if the TVA option is the least cost, or maybe the MISO market is the least cost, or in each case we'll come up with a different potential portfolio. And then we'll expose those, we'll look at each of the portfolios that come out of that, and we will test them against a wide range of outcomes. So the inputs that we're developing right now and going to show you are all driven by these different scenarios. The first 3 we described to you last time, and as you can sort of see in the base case forecast, whatever those forecasts are for each of those variables, in the high technology cases, you tend to see that they're going to be higher in some variables and lower in others. So in the high technology case, you're going to see faster declines in renewable and storage costs. You're going to see lower gas prices, lower coal prices, higher load, and higher economy. The other side of it is the high regulatory case, where in that case, you're going to see, in the high technology case, you see higher load, lower costs basically across the board, although it will be much lower in renewables and storage than it will be for gas and coal. I'll so you'll see higher gas prices, still lower coal prices because there's less demand for coal in either of those scenarios. But you will see higher, at least initial costs associated with a high regulatory case because they're forcing in higher costs to try and get to a higher level sooner. So what we're really trying to do is you look across the board and try and see, are we getting a balance on both sides of the forecast? In addition, several other options were raised by you in the last meeting, and we want to go through those as well with you today. One of them that was raised was a no inflation or a no real cost beyond inflation scenario, which is to say, let's just look at what these options look like today. Ignore the forecasts are always wrong, so that can actually give you a benchmark to sort of say, what does that portfolio look like if you were just focused on what these costs are today? And then you can compare that to some of these other scenarios so that you can sort of see, well, when you take the forecast into account, well, renewable costs are declining faster than gas costs and things like that. So you'll be able to see a distinction between the no real cost inflation or no real cost forecast scenario. There's also looking at the worst and best historical cases. How high have gas prices been in the last 10 to 15 years? How low have they been? That can construct boundary conditions as well. You can develop them through forecasts, or you can just basically look at history and say, well, if history repeats itself, what does that do? The climate crisis was the case that was raised a few minutes ago, basically. What happens if the weather gets much more severe? What happens if there's truly a climate crisis and it creates actions and activities? And the other one that was raised was the MISO operation. What happens if MISO changes its operating rules? On this one, I've got TBD because that's to be determined. We probably want some more clarity from you as to what you think might be the appropriate changes for us to look at. But for each of the other ones, we have sort of a slide to give an idea of what those might be if we were looking at them as scenarios. So the first one is the base case. And the base case, we consider that to be most likely. There's two ways you can do this. One is that Siemens actually provides, as a consultant, we provide forecasts to clients on a subscription basis. So what we're going to show you today for the base case is going to be our best guess forecast for each of these variables over a period of time. Sometimes when we do an integrated resource plan, we do kind of a consensus forecast for that. The consensus forecast might be to take whatever's in the public domain in terms of the various forecasts and take an average of it. I won't show you that today, but we could construct that if that's something that you think would be appropriate. Our hope is that by not relying too heavily on a base case forecast, but actually looking at these boundary conditions from the other scenarios, that will capture the uncertainty in what other forecasters are doing in that basis. But if you think it's important to do consensus rather than use the Siemens forecast as the base case, we can obviously do that. And in the base case, we basically are showing Illinois coal basin prices going down, mainly because of declining coal demand as a lot of the coal is being replaced, coal generation is being replaced in this region and largely across the country over time. So with lower demand, you will start to see lower prices. Only the most efficient coal mines are going to survive, basically, is what that means. Gas prices move up. Over a 20 to 30 year period, we're showing a 48% increase. But that's not that much. I'll show you the graphics in a minute. That's not that much in real terms. Even with a 48% increase, most of our baseline forecast is topping out a little over $4 per million BTU. And it's been hovering between close to $3 in the past. So it looks like a high percentage increase, but when you compare that to what happened back in 2008, where you were actually seeing peak prices around $13, the average prices for a year around $8, still not that much. The peak net and peak load forecasts are both rising at less than 1% a year, but we will be looking at the impact of electric vehicles and things, issues like that that could change the load forecast on the upside. And energy efficiency, higher levels of energy efficiency could actually make it be on the downside. So we'll look at uncertainties on those, but for the most part, through much of the country, a 0.5% increase, given the energy efficiency that's already taken place, is a fairly reasonable forecast. The big uncertainty is the electric vehicle forecast. And then capital costs will decline slightly for fossil resources and much more rapidly a little more rapidly for wind, which is a fairly mature technology, more rapidly for solar and for storage. So I'll be showing you pictures on all of these in a few minutes so that you can sort of see what I'm talking about. Yes, there's a question.
If we look at the period of 1999 through 2019, will we see a similar 48% increase in real dollars for gas prices over there?
It depends upon how far you go back.
Okay.
If you go back to 2008 and before, and I'll show you this graph actually, you'll see that there were times where prices were $8 per million on average for a year. That was pre-shale development. So the technological advance that occurred in that 2009, in that general time frame actually brought gas prices down, and they've been fairly stable. They've been bouncing around between a little under $3 and $3.50 or $4 for most of that time. So one of the reasons that we will be looking at uncertainty in the future is that over time, as you extract more and more gas, you start moving up the curve in terms of what the technology improvements have actually done, and you'll start depleting some of those lower cost resources. So we generally show that rising some, but not to the levels of the pre-shale time frame. So it's been bouncing around. It hasn't really done that much over the past 5 years or 6 years now. But regulations like fracking bans and things like that could result in much higher costs again. So you kind of have to consider the regulatory aspect as well as kind of the market aspect. Yes?
You show up there the Illinois Basin coal prices, but
Yeah.
what did you get when it shut down and was using Powder River Basin coal
Right.
in Wyoming?
We have both. We have forecasts for each of the regions. And we actually show, it's actually on the chart, the Powder River Basin or PRB prices, we actually show them rising slightly in real terms over time where the Illinois Basin goes down. The Powder River Basin has become the primary low sulfur supply basin even for many eastern utilities. It's always been in the west, but it really it has come pretty much to the east as well. So we do have slightly rising PRB prices, more due to the lack of technology advance, continued technology advance there, and you're depleting a lot of the bigger reserves there. So that's likely to go up a little bit. And that's less susceptible to demand because it's the lowest cost. It is probably more stable than the Illinois Basin. The drop in demand is probably going to hit the Illinois Basin before it hits the Powder River Basin. Yeah.
Since the levelized cost of solar power is less than the operating cost of coal, over the next 20 years, aren't all the coal plants just going to be shut down? There's no more value to them. They're better off, putting them to bed. And they're not even paying the externalities. Once they start paying for dealing with their coal ash ponds and everything like that, they gotta shut down.
It's a great question. The question is more when than if. It also depends upon the regulatory framework that each of the utilities are operating in. In some states, for instance, in states where there are a lot of coal reserves, some of the states will actually protect the coal, especially because a lot of the capital has already been invested. So some of those plants will last longer than others. We're certainly seeing that coal, if they cannot recover their capital costs, cover their operating costs and their going forward capital costs, they are moving to close those plants. If they're in a regulated environment rather than an unregulated environment, there is sometimes more protection for the plants for a longer period of time than if you're in an unregulated state where basically once you can't cover your cash flow, you're going to shut it down. So the answer is it depends. I think in general, coal will be shut down, but I don't see an environment where there's no coal plants left in 10 years, let's say. I think it's going to take a longer period of time for those plants to be retired. Any other questions? Okay, so the high technology case, again, this is sort of the framework. This scenario assumes that technology costs will decline over time. So relative to the base case, you're going to see in our graphs in a minute, you'll see that the costs of renewables in particular will drop more rapidly into potentially a somewhat lower level than they do in the base case. You'll also see improvements in battery storage, where right now, for instance, in some states, batteries are being forced in, like in California, to a certain level. The thought is that over time, the costs will come down fast enough so that they will become more economic faster than they are today. There will be some improvements in fossil, but not nearly the same direction. So when you look at the curves, you'll actually see a much steeper decline, even in the base case for renewables, than you'll see in fossil. But that would be more pronounced in the high technology case. With an abundance of low to no carbon generating technologies, CO2 becomes less of an issue. The demand for natural gas is offset in this case because there would be some improvement in technology due to fracking, but it won't be as significant as it would be on the renewable side. Less demand for coal means lower prices. Energy efficiency would be potentially a little higher in the early term, but would actually drop lower in the long term due to technology advances. And the other thing in terms of load is that we might see faster penetration of electric vehicles in that case, and that would mean higher overall load. So one of the things we'll ask you about in the breakout sessions is that, do these make sense to you? Because the idea behind a scenario is that it's a consistent story. And as long as the story holds together, then basically the direction of the input variables will fall, and then you have a plausible scenario that you're creating. It doesn't have to be your best guess, but it has to be plausible. So one of the things we'll ask you about is whether or not these bullet points actually make sense, or you think maybe something will go in a different direction. In the high regulatory case, we're talking about potentially a carbon tax or something like a carbon tax. We would probably, from a regulatory standpoint, impose something like we were looking at 5 or 10 years ago, probably 5 years ago now, in terms of a cap and trade kind of system of some sort. And we have a price on carbon that we would be putting on, and we'll show you what that could be in terms of the prices. Obviously, the regulatory framework is uncertain because there's really nothing other than the rule that's been put out by the administration. So basically, we'd have to construct a scenario that would drive carbon prices up over time. We put a fracking ban on, which would drive up the cost of natural gas. We put tighter regulations on burning coal. The coal price scenario probably doesn't matter as much over time, but lower demand is one, and that actually would reduce coal prices. If you're putting the regulations on the generation as opposed to the mining cost extraction, then coal prices can go down, but the cost of generation for coal can still go up. And that's really what is most likely to happen. On the coal side, traditionally, if you put safety regulations on mining coal or strip mining or things like that, that raises the cost of coal. But here, what seems to be happening more is that they're putting in regulations on the ash ponds or on other sorts of things that don't necessarily impact the price of coal, but it raises the cost of generating from coal. Yes, you have a question?
Have you considered that there would be a pushback with the high taxes because of less energy consumption, and that they would, that the power companies would issue a flat rate increase compensate?
Well, the impact on rates are really going to be a function of the way we're looking at it is the cost of generation. So how they recover those rates are basically going to be driven by, as Nelson pointed out, we'll be looking at the costs of the different portfolio over time, and we'll be looking at rates as the component of rates from the generation side and the transmission side is based upon the investment that's required over time to actually pay for it. How they recover those rates, whether they do it on a levelized basis or how do they do it, that's sort of outside the scope of the study, and that's an issue for JT to address. Okay, so in a lot of times if you impose higher regulation, you're forcing earlier than expected rising costs, which actually can dampen the effect of the economy, is the idea. There's actually potential in a high regulatory case to, at least in the near term, see higher costs because you're forcing in things like storage. Like in California, what they do is they force you to put storage in before it's economic, so therefore the cost actually go up for a period of time. But the idea over a longer period of time is that by forcing that, you may actually bring costs down faster in the long term because more research and development will go into it. Forcing higher energy efficiency, we see that as well, that basically if you make it stand on its own and economics at a certain level, if you force more than that, you'll actually raise costs in the near term. Over time, that actually can come down as well. So those were kind of the three cases. I'm also going to just at a high level talk about the ones that we just mentioned, which is the no inflation case. Actually, it's probably mislabeled. It's only inflation case, which means that there's no real increase or decrease in cost over time. So it's basically assuming inflation. Because every picture I'm going to show you in a few minutes is going to be in real dollars, which means inflation would be on top of that, but we just basically show it to you in real dollars. So that kind of looks at the world as it is today and says, what would that portfolio look like if we did that? I'm going to also mention one thing. It's terminology, but when I characterize something as a scenario, that's kind of all those bullets that I've just been talking about, and the idea of the scenario is that it's a plausible thing to look and see what the portfolio would look like under each of those different conditions. A sensitivity is kind of, once you've determined what the least cost portfolio is, you may want to test it. You may want to test certain things changing to that portfolio just to see what their costs might look like over time. So I'm kind of using that term to mean two slightly different things. And the reason that it matters is that, for instance, if you look at the worst case snapshot, and I'll show you a picture of this, basically that would look at what's the worst thing that happened to gas prices over time. Well, they hit $13 back in 2008. On average for the year, it was $8. That's the worst that could happen. So if you ran it as a scenario, you'd say, well, what if prices actually rose to $8 and just stayed there for 20 years? But of course, that's not what actually happened. It stayed there for 1 year, and then the prices actually came down. So if you run it as a sensitivity, you could run it to sort of say, well, what if history repeated itself and you saw high prices for a few years, as opposed to a scenario that says, let's take the worst that's ever happened and assume it happens forever. So that's kind of the distinction that I'm looking for here. The climate crisis This would be a real call to action because you're seeing extreme weather patterns. There's a premium on resiliency. You're seeing more hurricanes, more dangerous things, more flooding, more, you name it, whether it's drought or tornadoes or whatever it is, more extreme patterns that basically forces more incentives to be put in to deal with it more quickly. And that's kind of the more extreme case than the high regulatory case. Are there any questions before I actually start showing you some graphs and figures? JT?
And this may be redundant, but I just want to kind of point this out, given in light of the recent situation with the Saudi oil field situation and loss of significant oil supply. Is there a scenario that somewhat depicts unexpected? In other words, is it woven in? So there's the high rate case, and you've got the high tech case, and all that. But in terms of geopolitical issues or things that creates unexpected situations, how does that get baked into the case?
We often develop resiliency scenarios which can take extreme events that would impact for years, and we can identify what those are. When we did it in Puerto Rico, we basically looked at a repeat of Maria and Irma hitting the most dangerous places. In Hawaii right now, we're actually looking at combinations of volcanoes and hurricanes and all kinds of events. Another could be a worldwide event, like you're saying, that basically there's a war and it takes out a lot of the Mideast oil supplies, what that could do. So to the extent that you would want to do that, then those could be what we characterize as resiliency scenarios, where we test. Typically what we would do is we would use those scenarios that are shown here to try and define what portfolios you look at, but then we would test those portfolios against some of these resiliency scenarios just to see what would happen. And if they perform poorly, that's another qualitative measure that we could use to actually evaluate those portfolios over time. Because you typically don't assume that that's necessarily going to happen, although we kind of assume that in the climate crisis case, because we would construct a case that has a combination of worse weather patterns to occur. But basically that's what we would do. If you think that it's important to create some resiliency scenarios, that's something we could address in the breakout session today.
Here.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Two quick questions. On the demand estimation, I heard you say something about electric cars being separated out. Is that actually true? You have actually two different estimates, one being the base estimate of demand, and then you add to that electric vehicles.
Yes, actually a lot of what we do is we'll look at energy efficiency programs. It's actually a decline off of kind of the historical forecast, depending upon what the assumptions are. And then we have an electric vehicle forecast that we would put on top of that.
Details shown at some point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And the second question, on the climate crisis scenario, I think that's great that you have that, but I wonder, something interesting might be a twist of that says the regulations and everything else says no more carbon dioxide, and we have to do it as fast and absolute as we can, and just really, like going to the moon for 9 years,
Right.
Is this scenario sort of go that far? It doesn't quite.
I would say that it doesn't go that far, but we could. This scenario is basically one that you all suggested. So when we go into the breakout sessions, if you want to construct that to be a more severe case than what you see here, I would suggest that you put that forward and see if we can create a consensus, because that's a scenario that is really kind of outside of our core scenarios. So if you think that we should take in a more extreme one for the climate case or whatever, or add another case, suggest it. And obviously we have budget constraints we have to deal with. So at the end of the day, I'm going to ask you to also rank what you think is super important that we have to do, moderately important, and less important, so that at the end of the day, we're going to have to make some decisions on just what the trade-offs are between doing more scenarios and less. But that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Real quick,
is fascinating and really appeals to me, but that's figured in as well, right? Is there a scenario which scares the hell out of all of us, what's going on over in the Middle East? Is that same type of scenario possible for wind and the sun?
Well, hopefully the sun's gonna shine.
No, I'm talking.
The wind's gonna blow.
I'm talking about it, the power that is derived from those two sources.
Yes.
And because really, with everything that's going on with climate change now, we don't know what's gonna happen, and that is very fascinating to me.
Right.
That those are the areas where all of us would hope we would get our power, rather from coal,
Right.
rather from the Mideast.
Well, the way that we look at that is we basically consider them to be intermittent resources. So what that implies is that the sun isn't always going to shine and the wind isn't always going to blow. So you have to have resources to back that up, whether it's storage or some peaking technologies, fast ramping technologies that can support those when they're not there. So what you can construct in some of these scenarios is, well, what happens if it's much hotter and you have more, so we can look at capacity factors associated with the sun and the wind and look at uncertainty and how they perform, and then look at what has to happen to support those if it's more extreme. That's how we tend to look at it. Okay, so these are the ones that we're going to ask you to prioritize when we get to the breakout sessions in a little while. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you some forecasts. How are we doing time-wise? We've got about 20 minutes, right? Okay. So basically, I'm going to go through each of those 5 or 6 variables, and I'm going to show you some graphs. These graphs are basically starting with our base case, which is the Siemens best base case forecast over time, which is the dotted line. There are some other ones that are on the slide deck that we will end up showing you a range around those forecasts. What Siemens does is we develop statistical analysis based on historical patterns. In some cases, we have experts in each of these fields. So what we end up doing is we look at historical analysis, and like on a load forecast, just as you said, we will actually have several forecasts where we do a baseline, look at the uncertainty in weather patterns and population and things like that, and then we'll impose electric vehicles and energy efficiency on top of it. So it's a fairly complex process, but we develop our baseline forecast, which in the base cases you can sort of see. Today it's around $3, and we see it rising by 48%, but that only takes you to a little more than $4 over a 20-year period. These are in real terms, so if you wanted to think about it in inflation dollars, you'd add probably 2% inflation to these numbers, and it would be a little bit steeper. On top of that, we have our range of forecast, which is where we do our historical analysis associated with what could happen. And under fracking and other regulations and things like that, we actually show that there's on a 95th percentile, you can sort of see how those prices might go over time. And these are annual, which means that they could actually go higher than that for months at a time, and they could jump around. But basically, we're showing you the bands as to what the average annual prices might do over time. And on the low side, obviously, you've got a floor below it. That prices just can't go below because technology can't drive it. I mean, you have to have a certain recovery of costs to be able to cover your returns and things like that. So it's more on the high side than it is on the low side when you do these distributions. And then what we do is we said, okay, we put history in there. And so you now see the yellow line that goes back before 2019. And you can see that prices were about $9 on average in 2008. So if you had a fracking ban and you couldn't use the shale technologies that actually brought prices down and made them relatively flat over time, and you ask the question, well, what has it looked like? Well, it's bounced around a little bit from $4 in 2010 to down as low as about 275, and it's bounced back and forth over time. So that kind of shows you the history, and then we showed the upper band at the top and the lower bound at the bottom, so you can sort of see how our forecasted range fits within those historical bands, the dotted lines with the historical bands. Our forecasts actually go a little lower than that long term, and then we've actually put in the cases that we were recommending on top of that. So when you look at the high red case, you see that the prices actually go above $6 to about $6.50 on an annual basis. And then when you look at probably the lowest one is I'm trying to see the color here. The one that actually goes below it, I don't see the right color yet. Maybe that's that might be the high technology case. Yeah, it's probably the high technology case, which it looks like a different color, but that's the one that actually goes below the historical line a little bit. That's the last bullet and keeps gas prices relatively low over time. So this kind of shows you the idea of where those scenario prices would go, and also how, if we were going to test this over time with 200 iterations, induced stochastics, things like that, we would actually run 200 iterations that would actually bounce around within the blue area. So rising gas prices over time, but some scenarios would go up, some scenarios would go down, so that the $3 to $4 range could be as high as $6 or as low as $2.75. Same thing with coal. Here we're showing the Illinois Basin. We didn't do the Powder River Basin. That actually would go up a little bit over time from a different base. But again, we're showing declining coal prices over time, except in a couple of instances where basically we see a slight rise in the climate crisis case, where basically you'd force, through rising costs, you would force higher prices in to help encourage closing those plants down even more rapidly. But in some instances, you'd actually see prices going down and lower in cases where you're forcing the plants out and you have much lower demand, at least for Illinois Basin prices. National carbon prices. In the base case, the Siemens forecast is still to have some sort of either a carbon tax or cap and trade program sometime after 2025, even though there's not anything on the books at this point in time. But prices, even over time, don't get above $20. We've seen forecasts over time that went as high as $40 or $50. When we did analysis of the last cap and trade program, we never got over $20, in part because doing nothing was actually getting you very close to the cap and trade goals in terms of the reduction of carbon. And so you didn't have to do that much to actually get there. If you put a much more extreme target on, then you could potentially get higher prices. But there isn't anything that we've seen that would suggest that prices above $20 make sense. With that said, there are forecasts that we've seen that have gone higher, and basically in our high reg case, which actually reflects prices that go up around $40, $35 to $40, that actually can include something that might include some of the social cost of carbon. We've seen some estimates that take you to $40 or $50 when you do that. So we could run that case. In some cases, basically in there are no carbon regulations that would be imposed in the future, so we have actually on the low end being zero, even though our range of stochastics actually is under $5. Load forecast, again, this is about 0.5% to 1% a year on the baseline. This is MISO, Arkansas. And then the range of forecast depends upon the amount of energy Same thing with peak load forecast. It's a fairly similar picture. One is the average forecast, the other is the peak forecast. The peak becomes very important when we start looking at availability of power and outages and the loss of load probability. So we have to look at both peak load and the average load over time. And then we start looking at capital costs. And Nelson will describe in a little bit how we convert capital costs to a levelized cost of energy for some of these technologies. But basically, you can see some of the technologies that we have in here. The top line is coal with sequestration, carbon sequestration built into it, which obviously is very high cost at this point. We haven't seen anything any technology that would bring that down and make it competitive. The others, I'll show you a little bit more, because these basically, they're too scrunched together to sort of make heads or tails of it here, but you can sort of see that some of those lines are fairly flat. Those are typically your more mature technologies, like the combined cycle, the 2x1 combined cycle, which is kind of the orangish line, or whatever that color is. That's relatively flat over time. It comes down slightly as new technologies are brought in. But when you look at some of the other technologies, like the light green line, which is onshore wind, and you see batteries, they start at a much higher cost and they come down more rapidly. So these are just the capital components of these technologies. If you're doing fossil, then obviously you have to include gas prices and things like that on top of that. But this is just the capital cost that we see over time. This is basically the baseline for the combined cycle power plant, which is, I think, a 2x1, which means that there is a turbine associated with the combined cycle as well. And basically, we've got forecast, and then we actually have uncertainty associated with that forecast as well. But for the most part, they're mature technologies. So while you see a slight decline over time as they go to more efficient units, and the units get replaced with whatever the next advanced frame would be, then ultimately you start seeing slightly reduced heat rates, and so you do see some type of technological improvement in there. For wind, a decline again over time. The uncertainty is how much it will decline, and that is a function of kind of the different pressures that would be put on wind. In some instances, you could actually potentially see some cost increases a little bit over time in some of the scenarios. And in the climate crisis, you sort of see costs go up initially because you're forcing them to go more rapidly in the near term. But then again, that requirement actually, just like the expectation in California, which is that if you force something in, like storage, or force a technology in, more research comes in and actually reduces the cost in the long term. So you sort of see that graph kind of going up and then coming actually down faster than what the baseline forecast is. Solar is a more steep decline. You've been seeing that over the past several years, and we see that to continue to occur over time. But it eventually will become a mature technology and start to level out. The uncertainty is how fast that decline occurs and actually where it tends to level out. And then in our scenarios, obviously the yellow line is just no inflation, which says sort of if you ran a no inflation scenario, it basically would penalize your renewable technologies. Because basically you'd be looking at those costs today, and we're seeing those costs actually decline fairly rapidly over time. Same thing with the climate crisis, up initially and then down a little bit faster. Yes?
Will your forecast take into account federal funding some of this, or will it take that on the solar one?
It doesn't. The way that we are basically doing it is we're not looking at the funding mechanisms as much as we are the regulations that would require it to happen. So if there's federal funding that would subsidize some of these things, then actually for the developer, that may actually reduce the cost and make it look more attractive, even though the actual cost is higher because it's being subsidized, but it's not necessarily higher to the developer. So that's another way of a high reg case, which actually the actual cost is reflected in what we're doing, but the subsidy makes it look attractive to the developer. So I think it basically comes out about the same. So the last one is storage. Again, starts relatively high, but it is probably the steepest ramping technology, and you tend to see the same sort of things, that basically in the climate crisis, costs will go up, but you will see more of it, and then it will come down more rapidly. The other ones is basically how fast is the decline curve that you're actually seeing. Are there any questions with regard to these? We can provide you with tables and numbers if that would be helpful. But what we're trying to do here is to give you an idea for what these plausible boundary conditions are, taking history into account, taking future forecasts into account, because ultimately, when you're evaluating these technologies, and we'll talk about transmission and other things in a few minutes, but ultimately, we're going to expose all of these options and determine what the least cost portfolio is to meet all of them, considering those four or five strategies. And then we're going to look at all of those metrics that we're talking about that would influence it. So a lot of this has to do with whether you believe the input assumptions that are driving this, and if we're missing something. Yes?
These are all national averages that you're using?
These are, yes, that's true. So basically,
Local adjustments?
we do have local adjustments that we will have, and ultimately, for instance, you saw it on the load forecast, for instance, we picked Arkansas. You know, where we're taking coal, we're taking it from certain coal fields, and then we're delivering it to the various locations that will be selected. And we will be looking at transmission options later. So ultimately, depending upon where these resources are located, we will have to make sure that the costs reflect the appropriate local adjustments. Yes. Other questions? I think the next slide is the feature. I'm not sure.
Well, thanks, Gary. I just want to kind of, as we transition now, we're going to transition to lunch, and then they'll come back and finish. But I want to make a couple of comments just to make sure that I think the conversation's been great, and I think that now maybe it's becoming more clear how significant it is as we go through this process and making a decision about what to do. That there are a lot of factors. I heard Dennis mention earlier that he had done forecasting in his past, and I had a spat of that in my utility past several years ago. And one of the things that I will concur with what I think we heard Gary say, when you're doing forecasts, especially as we were looking at what may happen with regards to energy sources and all of that, and fuel types, you're going to always generally be wrong. And that's why you have to do so many scenarios. It's just this is the way it is, right? And so whether you're trying to do a price forecast or a forecast in this regard, and so it's really, really important to understand that there is probably no one source or no one scenario that is going to be 100% accurate, and that's the reason this process is the way it is. So again, I think this is great, and I know later we're going to have a few minutes for the breakout session and have a little bit more conversation. Lunch is here, and so I think we're going to take a break right now, and everyone, like we've done before, feel free to grab here. I want to just clarify, before we go to breakout, you're going to have do you have another piece? One more section, okay. So here's what we'll do. We'll break, do the lunch, and then there'll be one more presentation, and then we'll transition to the breakout group, okay? Great, thank you.
self-supply strategy. Remember, that's the one that will be assessing where MLGW installs its own generation. So it's very, very important that we come to an agreement that what we have here are the technologies that we need to consider. We're not missing anything. If we're missing something, it's the time to make it clear and make us aware that we're missing something. And if there is something that you don't believe should be there, then also this is the time to talk about it. I'll be presenting several parameters, several costs, and that comes from a well-established process that in Siemens, particularly EDA, have been developing over the years. And in a snapshot, they started looking at a technology database. Those are both, on one hand, actual projects that are being built, and on the other, databases created by third parties like NREL, GlassArt, the Energy Information Administration, Agency Administration. In general, sources that we can inform our process. We always keep them within 3 years of them. So we wouldn't be going back and look at a project that was developed 5 years ago. Then, and it may also include client confidential data, projects that we've been involved. So once we got all of this technology database, we go to a screening process. There are some projects that have particular issues with them, so are being dropped. Or another aspect is that we need to take into account the locations. Like for example, we mentioned earlier that when we create the capital and operating cost for a project, we consider the location. On the other hand, when we're looking at a project that was built on a given location, California, to mention one that have a very high location cost, then that needs to be adjusted. So basically, then on this process, we adjust all of our inputs to the technology database, and then we create our assumptions. The first output from that, you already saw in what Gara presented. You remember that we presented, for example, for wind, a cost that was declining, but then a band around it. That shows our expectations on how that cost is likely to vary in the future around that mainline projection. Also, this is informed from expert opinions and uncomparable national samples. Like for example, sometimes our forecast may be different than NREL's forecast, and we assess, okay, why is that? And that gives us information on the variability of that forecast. Very important and very difficult to predict is the expected rate of technology improvement. You saw, for example, that the wind was assumed to be fairly constant, with marginal gains on capacity, while solar is coming down rapidly, and storage even more rapidly. And we normally use both public and private sources as a comparison and guidance. So it is an overall process that then results into this. And sorry for, but you have it, sorry that it's not too clear, but these are the options that are going to be considered currently in our analysis for the self-supply. On the first hand, we have the combined cycles. This is basically a gas turbine with a boiler, the heat recovery steam generator, and then a steam turbine. It's a very efficient, it's a technology that's been there for quite some time. Nowadays, it's very flexible because of it needs to integrate with renewables, can start and stop relatively fast, can cycle every day, and give you some sort of this counterparty to the risk that is introduced by intermittent resources like wind and solar. It complements the storage. And in principle, over time, you see some scenarios in which it's phased, if the combined cycles phase out and storage comes in, or as a main player. However, we would expect that given the cost decline, that combined cycles will be part of the equation. And we have two combined cycles, and let me go over the different parameters. First is burning natural gas, construction time 3 years. This is the capacity, so we have two combined cycles, 950 megawatts, a very big one, and then 350 megawatts, a smaller one. When you go to a smaller size, you have more flexibility in the sense of right sizing the unit, but you have some penalties in cost. This is what we call the heat rate. The heat rate is nothing but how much fuel you need to consume to produce a kilowatt hour. The higher it is, the worse it is. And then you see, for example, that the combined cycle, the big one, has a little bit over 6,000 BTUs, thermal units per kilowatt hour, while the smaller one is 6,500, so it's less efficient. Then we have your variable and fixed O&M. These are separate from the fuel. It's just to operate the plant. And again, we have the smaller combined cycle has a higher variable operating cost than the bigger one. And same thing with the fixed cost. So here you see clearly an impact of the economies of scale. So when we're doing the capacity expansion plan, the optimal capacity expansion plan, the program will try to balance. If I pick a big one, I have less flexibility in right sizing to the need, but I have lower costs. On the other hand, and the opposite happens with the smaller one. Here we have the emissions are very similar in pounds per million BTU of CO2. And the capacity factor, fairly similar. Capacity factor, again, you can think of it as the average use. It's nothing but the energy that is produced divided by the maximum energy that it could have produced if it were full out all of the hours of the year. So the higher this value, the more frequent the unit is dispatching. Then, so these are what we call our base load units. Then we have the peaking units. These are the advanced frame combustion turbines. And we have again before one large and one small. Again, to try to right size, give the program the option to right size them. These guys, what they do is that they provide peaking service. When you have your solar is going down, your wind is going down, your combined cycles are coming up, then you have a peak at night, or you have one of the combined cycles trip, then these guys come into play. Or for example, you start having a very rapid reduction of your solar because of a storm moving in, then these guys can come online. So they are not as efficient. Look at the heat rate in the order of the 7,000 to 8,000, so they consume a lot more fuel. Sorry, this word here, 8,000 to 9,000. They can be built relatively fast, about 2 years. They have variable cost higher than your combined cycle, but the fixed costs are very low because they require a lot less personnel to manage. So all of the fixed costs are relatively low. And finally, we have a very low capacity factor, showing that they operate very frequently. It's not rare to see these peaking units who have a capacity factor of 5%, which means that they run at full capacity only 5% of the time. So those are our main thermal options. Then after that, we have coal with carbon sequestration. And in this case, 600 megawatts for a fairly large plant, construction type 5 years, and a fairly high heat rate. In other words, it consumes a lot more coal per kilowatt hour than it produces, similar to, for example, look at this, similar to our combustion turbines. The saving grace of this one is that the coal is cheap. The capital costs, as you saw before, are fairly high. Look at the fixed operating costs, it's also very high, but once you build it, it will run all the time. 85% capacity factor. Let's tell you that's all the time being dispatched. So that's the last of our thermal technologies, and then we go back to our solar and wind. These are just representative capacities. It takes, considering a 50 megawatt plant, but it can be blocks of 50 megawatts, it can be 200 megawatts. Let's assume to be a block of 50 megawatts, and the onshore wind will be a block of 100 megawatts. There is no heat rate associated with them. Solar PV, about 1 year construction. Onshore wind, 2 years construction. Variable operating costs are basically for wind. For solar, there is no real variable operating cost. And by variable, I mean cost that changes as a function of the energy that is produced. In wind, it makes sense because they're spinning more often, so something wears out, so it does have a variable operating cost. And finally, these are the typical capacity factors. In this case, and this is important, for the thermal, capacity factor is something that you control. You can decide, I want to run this unit. For wind and solar, it's something that you're given by the technology, by the resource that you have, and the technology that you have. You produce the maximum that you can. So the capacity factors are given in PV and wind. It's something that you can choose to optimize on the dispatchable resources. And that brings us to the last element, which is the storage. And the storage, although we'll be presenting it, is cost on standalone, in reality, it's an enabler. You use storage to enable the integration of your renewables. The cheaper the cost of storage, the easier it will be to integrate your photovoltaics. And at the end of the day, we see that it's a combination of the two, of storage coming down and photovoltaics coming down, and that really results in an increase in installation in the plants. Why? Because now it's cheaper to produce your energy during noontime when your load tends to be low, and then dispatch it at night. With that, yes, please.
Now, so the battery storage, are those operating cost net of any cooling load that's needed to keep the batteries from overheating, or the battery systems on? How do you deal with the parasitic load?
Okay, there are two aspects that are dealt with it, and that's an excellent question. This cost that we see here, and just actual dollars out of the door to get it to operate. And in fact, there is something that we call the, every certain years you have to make investments on the battery banks just to keep them alive. So that's also included in the cost. However, the aspect that also is there is that you need energy to cool the batteries. And that's part of the efficiency. When we model the batteries, we model it with a 10% efficiency. So for every megawatt that goes in, only 900 come out. So yes, that's part of the cost.
I would ask, going forward, perhaps a glossary would be helpful.
Yes. Yes.
The usual audience may be energy experts, but you're dealing with a bunch of labor here. So
That's why I stopped and tried to explain each one, because to us it's natural, but
right.
maybe in your field you talk about your glossary and say, wow, why is that? But
because part of it too, as a council person, I'm the one who's going to take this back to my colleagues.
Right.
And then it'll be upon us to take it back to our community. And so if I look at capacity factor, I need to be able to explain it to them in a way that they can understand. And if you're dealing with people, different disciplines that may not be energy,
right.
if we need that glossary to reference back to even after this meeting.
And even in our industry, the capacity factor, sometimes call it plant factor. Even in the industry, but it's a crucial component because it tells you how hard you're using your asset.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that we'll need that for all of them.
Yeah, no. And for heat rate in particular, and 4,000 is like, yeah. Yeah, no.
We can do that next
Yes.
week or so.
Okay. Do we have more questions? And on one other important aspect on batteries that, oh yes.
You have a forecast in the performance effectiveness of the various technologies into the future. Is that covered in the Southern forecast? The solar technology is improving, battery technology is improving. So that's included in the overall planning?
Okay, the key, yes it is, and I'll enter a little bit in the details. On wind, for example, we have a slightly decline in capital cost, but in wind we expect to have a significant gain in capacity factor. That's the performance gain that we expect to see there. On solar, most of the forecasts that we have seen and we're using assume that most of the gains are going to go into a reduction in cost rather than improving performance. So you'll see that the capacity factor, again, the energy that you can produce in average over the years is fairly constant. So it's not fully there.
So your point though is that we do have a forecast basically the capacity factors. So performance is a combination of heat rates, capacity factors, and cost. And we do have forecasts for each of those that we can provide.
Yeah, but in solar, the heat rates, these are the facts that for.
In the case of batteries, Elon Musk has promised that his next generation of batteries and Tesla cars will be able to go 1 million miles.
Okay, excellent that we talked about that. Because we do in batteries, the challenge that Elon Musk has is they have to be compact and they have to be portable. For this type of application, the portability is not really an issue. The issue really in this case is how much energy you need to store. And in the forecast, we basically give four options, and that tends to cover exactly what the plant needs. When you start seeing that the plant picks a little bit of each option, you realize, hey, I'm in the ballpark. And basically it's 2 hours storage, 4 hours storage, 6 hours storage. And then the question, that's a service. And then the question, how the costs come down, and that's where we're factoring what Elon Musk may be seeing is to how to make those cheaper.
Yeah. Well, my point is that early generations of batteries did not have a very long life because they would lose 5% of their capacity, 10%
Yep, and I know exactly where we could account for it. There is something that is called, I mentioned earlier, the technical name is augmentation. That's the investment that you need to do on the batteries to account for the degradation. Now, of course, much, much less than before, but there's still some. So, in as much one potential scenario, and let's add that to the discussion, is where these augmentation costs are not nearly as high as we have, which they're substantial. So if you put, let's go to the extreme, that they don't degrade and they last instead of 15 years that we have here.
That might be a scenario or a sensitivity that we could run
Yep.
based upon the degradation rate
Oh.
of batteries. That we
Yep.
could run as a sensitivity. See
Yeah.
if it happens.
The augmentation and the life. It's not in this slide, it's in the next slide. We have 15 years life, which is a problem. If we say, no, it's going to have 20 years life, which we have done in other cases, and you don't have augmentation costs, then that obviously will result in more batteries. And guess what? I just mentioned it. There'll be more photovoltaics being incorporated. So it may be an intelligence sensitivity. Any other questions? If not, I just wanted to add with batteries, they are a multi-service element. We just talked about the ability to shift energy from daytime to nighttime, but they also provide reserves, they also provide regulation, they also provide help during emergencies when a plant trips. They provide also what we call frequency response, which is to maintain the system frequency stable. All right, so that's one of the elements. The other element, you remember that I mentioned early on that one key metric is the present value of the revenue requirements. That's, or in other words, how much do we have to pay for a given installation? Here is where we have the parameters that go into that. Like when you buy a house, how long do you have to pay, and what's the interest rate that you have to pay for it. Here we have for each of the technology, what is the life of the asset. Like for example, for all of the thermal, we have 30 years, except for coal 40 years, and for wind 30 years, and as I mentioned earlier, for batteries, just 15 years. So we have to be fully amortized in 15 years. This is the debt life. In other words, the time in which we have to repay whoever develops, whether it's the city or a third party, needs to be repaid. The depreciation schedule. And then we have the cost of equity and the cost of debt. And in this case, what I'm showing here is generic values. The first number corresponds to a utility, and the next number corresponds to a merchant, like a developer that builds the power plant and signs a PPA with MLGW. The case of MLGW is particular, and we need to have and we're having a discussion about it in the sense that being a municipal company, there is no equity, but there is a cost of debt. But in general, let's first go over the different elements, and then let's go back to what would be the case for a plant developed by MLGW. So first we have the cost of equity for a utility, like Duke, for example, it's 9.7%. For a merchant developer, it's 13%. Because of their size, their risk, they have a higher cost of equity. Cost of debt is how much it costs for them to borrow money, Usually a utility is a lot less than for a merchant or a developer. The equity ratio, so 45% of the asset is being financed by and 55% is financed by debt. And that results in what we call the weighted average cost of capital, how much it costs to obtain the capital to develop a project. And at the end, that's the discount rate. That's equivalent to the mortgage that you pay in your house. So over here, this gives you an idea of the time, and this gives you the interest that you would have to pay. And a utility is lower, like 6%, and a merchant plant is higher, like 8.7%. One value that we are developing, it's what would be the equivalent weighted average cost of capital for MLGW. Any questions on this topic?
Do you have the initial capital cost on these? The initial capital cost for these investments?
The capital cost for this investment. Yeah, that's what we presented. Well, here, these are the capital. We discussed initially the capital cost. Right now, we're just presenting the additional elements that go. So, for example, if you were to develop this, let me just go to solar. So let's say that you were working on the base case and you were to develop a solar project in 2026. Then your capital cost would be $1,200 per kilowatt. Then that would be your capital. Then you take your amortization, 30 years, and your weighted average cost of capital, that you convert into your annuity, which is your equivalent as your mortgage payment, how much you have to pay every year for this project. And if you divide that by the energy that is produced, then we get what we call the levelized cost of energy that will be discussed. Yeah. And this is my next slide. But before I go there, are we clear in this? Then what we did in this slide, what we're showing, is exactly that exercise that I just described. You take the capital, you convert it into annuity, you take the whatever O&M, you add it to it, you take the fixed O&M, you add it to it, you divide by the total energy produced, and you get how much it costs for each generating option to operate. And this gives you an idea of ranking. It also gives us an idea when something's going to be picked up and when it's not going to be picked up in the expansion plan. We see here, oh, this is so clear. Sorry that this color is not coming. But what we see here, for example, this blue one here on top, that's the batteries. For batteries, it's kind of difficult to find a levelized cost of energy because they really take energy from the grid and deliver it. What we're doing here is assuming that the battery charges and discharges every day. And that gives us the energy component that we're dividing. So it's the total cost divided by the energy of charging and discharging every day. We see, for example, here, this is very interesting. This one is our cheapest combined cycle. And this one here, the red, is our solar. So just by themselves, solar by itself, it will overtake the combined cycle according to these projections by 2030. It'll become one of the cheapest resources. And wind, which is the one below, it's already promising to be cheaper than our thermal resources. We see, for example, that coal carbon sequestration is unlikely to be peaked. And we see here, and this is typical, that the peaking units, when you evaluate the cost of energy produced, is very high. And why is that? Because in reality, they're there to provide energy and capacity when nothing else can be there in such a time, to provide peak, what they call peaking service. So it's not a base load, it's not to provide energy, it's to provide capacity.
Now, just a point, you said wind is already lower than combined cycle, but that's just the wind component. It doesn't operate all the time, so you have to combine it with some peaking resources for storage to make it a one-on-one comparison.
Well, yeah, this is a levelized cost of energy. But can you live with only wind? No, you can't. Maybe that's what you're alluding to. No, you can't. Because if you could, I mean, you could, but then you need to put storage if you don't want to have combined cycles. And then, and we've done that. We take the total cost of the storage plus the total cost of the renewables together, and we find that just making that 100% renewable right now will be competitive. In fact, will be very, very costly. But again, we will give the program these options to pick, and they'll pick the least cost option according to the different scenarios, under the different scenarios. This graph also shows how the different technologies stack up. This is again the cost of energy, dollars per megawatt hour produced, but now a change in capacity factors. And we see, for example, when we go to very low capacity factors, which is...
I'm sorry, just remind me what capacity factor.
Yes. Capacity factor is how hard or how often you run the unit. It's the energy produced by the maximum energy that it could have produced if it were to run full out all of the hours of the year. So a low capacity factor is telling you that these units only come during the peak at night for a few hours and then turn off. A few hours and then turn off. A very high capacity factor means it's all out all the time. So we see here that when we go to very low capacity factors, which is peaking service, we see here our combined cycle, and then below we have our frame cities, our gas turbines. So this is telling us that yes, it's likely that if we provide peaking service, the program will peak gas turbines. Will it peak the small simple cycles, the small cities? If it were only for cost, probably not. The only advantage to those units is that they are 50 megawatts, so they can be right-sized. So the program will make the balance. I need, let's say, 100 megawatt of peaking. Do I install a 200 megawatt because it's cheaper on a per kW basis, or do I install a smaller city, although it's more expensive on a per kW basis? So that's the type of decision that the program will do. And then at higher capacity factors, we see that, ignore for the time being the batteries, because in reality, you cannot run them at high capacity factor. We probably should delete this from. But we see that very high capacity factors, you see right there, a very high capacity factors, the combined cycle tends to be your best option. So when you're trying to provide large amount of energy, the combined cycles tend to be the option that is selected by the program. So with that, do we have any questions on the options in general? Yes.
So can you go back one slide, please?
Sure.
And I guess it's not clear there, but based upon the current material, and I know that these are just projections, but I'm looking at That's when you talk about we have to add to because they're not continuous sources. So based upon this, we're somewhat looking, and I know it's not, I may not be quite accurate at this. Based upon these projections, may not be until 2025 or beyond that the combined cost of the two would be sort of comparable to the simple cycle CP. But that's what we have.
It is
That's what we have to
possible.
factor.
It
You can't
is-
look at it in isolation.
Exactly.
Okay.
It is possible. And that's why the use of these tools like Aurora to do the capacity expansion tools are so useful. Because then you'll find that the optimal is really a combination. Like we found in Puerto Rico, the project that I was working on, that when you, for every megawatt of photovoltaics, you put about 50 or 0.5 megawatt of storage, you get to an optimal solution. So, and that we learn just by looking at the results and say, okay, now it makes sense. So it'll be combining your wind, for example, with combined cycles and storage. So it'll be part of the mix.
Unfortunately, you also have to consider time of day and things like that, because basically solar is gonna be during certain times of day, wind can be other times of day. So that's, again, why you need a model to actually optimize these combinations, because the levelized costs give you some indication, but they're not necessarily gonna optimize all the load factors.
One factor, this slide improves it from what you have in your, I'm going to be getting this new version. Because I realized that the one that you have was too small to see the details. But unfortunately, here when I'm projecting, you see that it's very faint here. That curve that I'm following, that's your regular combined cycle, your 300, the type of combined cycle that the seed is likely to peak. And it's much earlier that it starts competing with solar. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a combination of solar plus photovoltaics very early on in the time. Any more questions? If not, we move to transmission. Oh, yes.
I'm not sure exactly where it fits, but water is becoming a growing concern, and not just droughts, because of climate change, but the use of water in many areas of the country. Memphis fortunately has a good supply of water, but at some point in time it becomes a risk factor, and the costing of these models here needs to include the cost of water. Water cannot be free.
Right. And that's, again, a very good point. Because whenever we design the cost of combined cycle, now by default we always go to air-cooled condensing. So basically we have chillers, and that minimizes the use of water at a cost.
Right, so is the water cost included in your model?
Currently, it's minimized in the sense by instead of going to water-cooled condensing, but air-cooled, then it uses a lot less water. But we can have a discussion on the amount of water that it uses and put the cost to it.
Combined cycle natural gas plant wastes about 15% of the water that's used. Correct? It's evaporated in the air. Solar panel, you don't lose it anymore.
Exactly. So, yeah, what you're saying, I think it's a very valid point. In the same way that we value the fuel that goes into the plant, then we should assess how much water goes into the plant and put a cost to it. Okay. They use a lot less water. It's not the cooling tower, it's just chillers.
How efficient is it?
Now we have to ask. From a manager demanded they have condensing. No one through or much less cooling towers. But yes, I see your point. So we need to assess, even using air-cooled condensing, how much water it would use and treat it as another cost factor. With that, then let's move to our last point of before the breakout, which is the transmission.
Yeah, I gotta introduce myself. I just want to test this a little bit. Hey, my name is Yan Du. I'm with the Siemens PTI Power System Consulting at the Houston office. I have about 10 years transmission planning background, and I work under Nelson. I'm going to be the lead consultant for the overall transmission analysis for this IRP. And in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some interesting stuff associated with the transmission. And hopefully we didn't make it too technical. The transmission analysis, we started from first of all, the transmission transfer capability analysis. That's part of the overall transmission analysis. The other major part is also the overall transmission reliability of the MLGW system. Sorry, I need to move closer. It's one of the required exercise that we need to do to assess the transfer capability for various strategies. For example, the BAU, which is the status quo with TVA, that basically we need to assess that how much transfer capability from the TVA generators to the sink where the MLGW is. And then the most important strategy is also that we need to assess the transfer capability that if MLGW is going to purchase from MISO. So we need to assess the transfer capability that how much MISO power can be imported from the MISO South region into TVA and then finally delivered to MLGW. And of course, there are also self-supply options where MLGW will develop our own generations, and those generations are likely to be sited inside of the MLGW territory or very close. So the transfer capability is not that critical. The key transmission analysis for that option is basically the local reliability around those generators. Then we have the combined strategy, whether it's self-supply plus MISO purchase, or a combination of or purchase from TVA, purchase from MISO, and also self-supply. So as you can see, among all these strategies, the critical assessment that we need to do first is to assess the transfer capability if we go for the MISO option. Okay. So in this exercise, we're going to identify the bottleneck, which is where the weakness is. It's going to be analyzed under contingencies, -1 contingency. For example, if one of the line is outage, and what's the transfer capability under that scenario. And we will, at this moment, is going to review there are some of the transmission upgrades options or expansion options to improve that transfer capability. And all these transfer limit numbers will be used as input to the long-term capacity expansion plans and also the nodal production cost simulations. And feel free to ask the questions whenever you have. So in this exercise, we need to define the source and sink. So for BAU option, it's simple, and the source will be all TVA generators. The sink will be the MLGW as a total load system or load pocket. And the transfer will be coming from TVA generators through the TVA to MLGW interface lines and delivered to MLGW. The MISO strategy is a little complicated because MLGW is a load pocket without any self-generation. So it's so there's no generation to be ramped down per se. So we need to think about the scenario when MLGW is going to purchase all the power from MISO. So what's going to happen is the generators in MISO South region will ramp up, and the generators that are in TVA that are close or high impact to MLGW system are going to ramp down. So you initiate the power transfer that's going from the MISO South into the kind of the West Tennessee area, and finally deliver to MLGW. That's the scenario that we're created to assess the transfer capability. And of course is going to be the most critical option. The combined options or market purchase combined options will require less transfer capabilities than the MISO option, because you also purchase from TVA that you have existing well interconnected system with the TVA. With that, we have identified several generators that have high impact to the delivery points on the MLGW system. Those we're going to show these generators in the next slide, where we have the geographic map and how they connect electrically. But as you can see, that's the Allen combined cycle, which has more than 1,000 megawatts combined cycle. That's very close to MLGW. In fact, it's almost like within MLGW in the west along the river. And there are also Lagoon Creek combined cycle, South Haven, which is located around Freeport, and Gleason, CT, Magnolia, combined cycle, Shawnee, also that's located in western Kentucky, just Paducah area, and Brownsville, CT. So there's at least more than 5,000 megawatts generation that have more than, let's say, 5% of impact. It's a number that we have the threshold that those are the most impactful generators from TVA. They deliver most of the power, if not all, to MLGW currently. That's based on the summer peak scenario. So they are full output. Yeah.
They're providing to TVA for MLGW now.
Yes. They are TVA generators.
Okay, so TVA owns.
if you go with MISO options, those generators will likely to be ramped down, but not necessarily no output. They will still output, but it's going down. This is more than the MLGW peak load is. Okay? So as you can imagine that if you initiate the power transfer going from MISO south to TVA and eventually to MLGW, you're gonna, the MISO south generators will ramp up and the transmission flows on those MISO south to TVA interface lines will increase, and the TVA generators will ramp down in this case. And we assess the transfer limit under any single transmission element outage scenario. Because the transmission flows on the interface lines keep going up, and one line will reach its limit, and under contingency, that's where we know the most amount, the amount of power you can transfer from MISO into TVA. And based on that, we're gonna identify the reinforcement or the transmission upgrades options. So think about it. What if you can upgrade that line to increase its capacity, so that line will not reach its limit, and so and then you can keep ramping up the power, increasing the flows until the next transmission line reaches its limit. There's some basically different options you can go. Either upgrade the line or build a new line, or resolve the critical contingency that causing the line binding. Okay, so color is not really great on the projector, but on your printed slides, that on the left hand we show a geographic map of the MISO South region and TVA. I call this 30,000 feet view of the in the region. That on the map, there's the green area should show the MISO South, including the Arkansas and Mississippi, and on the gray color area, kind of on the right-hand side, is where the TVA, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and a little bit of Alabama. So on the map, okay, so right now we know that we have a TVA delivery, 4 delivery points. That's Shelby on the northeast side, and Cordova 500 kV, Freeport, and Allen in the west. Oh, by the way, those orange lines are 500 kV. Those are the highest kV lines, and there are also blue that's our 230 kV lines, and the black that being 161 kV lower kV lines. But we focus on the first the major 500 kV lines are those lines represent most of the power interchange between TVA and MISO South. So here in this map, we can see that there are MISO bus or substation in Dell to some intermediate buses and are delivered to Shelby. That's a 500 pass. And there's also Gleason all the way, Lagoon Creek, connecting the generator to Shelby. And on another east segment is Brownsville City, and the 500 kV delivered to Cordova. and also the kind of the southeast pass is the 500 kV connecting Magnolia combined cycle to Cordova. And at the same time, you have South Haven generators at the Freeport bus, and on the west hand side is mainly MISO South, and you have a 500 pass from Peel bus to West Memphis, and where the Allen bus is located, and there's an Allen combined cycle. And the other pass is the 500 kV from north to south. It's a Dell to Shelby, where there are MISO generators at Dell and Plum. These are MISO. The Plum is a coal, Dell is a combined cycle, Independence combined cycle, White Bluff coal, and the Arkansas nuclear power. So this bubble represents the MLGW system. So the arrow of the orange arrows are representing the summer peak flow direction. So you can see this is going from north to south, and from MISO to TVA, and there you have also TVA 500 kV lines flowing in towards the MLGW direction. And this 500 kV is also interface between MISO South and the TVA, and Wolf Creek Adams. In the summer peak normal condition, it's actually going from TVA out into MISO South. Okay. This line is rated at 2500 MVA. This line is rated at 17, a little more than 1700 MVA. So this line plus this line are actually have more than 4300 MVA capacity. That's going into TVA on the interface. As you can imagine, this line, 500 kV line, is rated slightly lower than this path. When we wrap up MISO South generators and wrap it down TVA generators, you're going to push more power on these two major lines, and also this one. So this line will become your bottleneck because it will reach its limit earlier than the higher rated line under contingency. Okay, so that's when this line reaches a limit. That's when we determine the transfer capability is currently. So, but under any conditions, any strategies that MLGW are well interconnected with TVA, and hopefully TVA will not open their breakers or retire their lines around you. So under any conditions, you're well interconnected with TVA, you have the reliability, and just in case some of the lines are out, and all the loads should be served. On this map, it's a duplicate map. Kind of, we show how the power are flowing, how much power are flowing on those lines. Okay. Oops. Okay. So as we mentioned, we're gonna increase the generation in the MISO South region and decrease the generations for those TVA generators. And before we initiate that transfer, so here I'm showing you the summer peak flow amount that from Dell to Shelby, that's about more than 900 megawatts. And from here to West Memphis, it's about 740 megawatts. And this path is actually going from TVA to MISO, it's at 700 megawatts flowing. and there are also 250 concrete to Shelby, 30 megawatts, Brownsville to Cordova, and about 900 megawatts from Magnolia to Cordova. That's before the transfer. And after the transfer, imagine we increase the MISO generators, so the power is generally going to push this to the east direction and push back the power from the TVA side. So after the transfer, there is about 1,500 megawatts going from Dell to Shelby, okay, and 1,365 megawatts going from Kiel to West Memphis. And this line, actually the flow will reverse. It's now going from MISO to TVA, okay? And this Brownsville line is also reversed. It's going from the Cordova to Brownsville direction, okay? And then you can see the Lagoon Creek to Shelby is decreased, and Magnolia to Cordova is also decreased. And this is showing under summer base case under normal condition without any contingency. But imagine if we're not going to show exactly the contingency due to some CI information, but you can imagine this line will reach its limit pretty fast because it's rated at 1,700 megawatts.
Running a little bit out of time, but I just wanted to communicate a couple of things very importantly. First, this system that you're seeing here is secure in the sense that those transfers can be obtained, and then if a contingency were to happen, nothing would overload. So this is secure. The second aspect that is very important, it's the way power systems operate in the US. You can see here that on the base case, that power was going through MISO, through the TVA system and back into MISO. That's a fairly normal operation of the system. So it flows from one system into another system and back into your original system. The important thing is that your system has to be continuous. That means that for MLGW to be part of MISO, you need to have a connection into MISO. That doesn't mean that all of the power that we buy from MISO will have to go through that connection, but we need to have a connection. And that's something that we're exploring, a connection in Allen. There is a 161 kV line there, and there is a connection in Freeport. So there are 2 points where MLGW and MISO come right there at the same point. So those are the 2 points where we're seeing to have a physical connection. So what you're seeing here is how the flows will go through the main lines, but there will be a physical connection, and it's secure. And just sorry to hijack you. The important component is that those transfer before we reach into any unsecured condition, we're able to import 100%, more than 100% of the peak load. So this is telling us from a preliminary basis that the transmission system that is there is enough to back down the generation in TVA, increase the generation in MISO, and supply 100% of the load in MLGW. With the caveat that we need to establish at least a couple of physical connections between the two systems. And this is what we're saying here, that although most of the flow is through TVA lines, and we have to pay for it, there's no free willing here, we have to pay for it, but the physical connection will be there. which is Allen and Freeport. Other aspects that will be shown here is that summer is the most critical, the bounding. Winter, we have more capacity. And on the business as usual, from TVA to MLGW, the way we assessed it is, because we didn't have any generation to back down, what we did is effectively increase the load in MLGW. And we found that we could fit up to 4,000 megawatts in summer, or a significant increase. About the load could increase by 780 in summer and about 1,500 megawatts in winter. And with that, there you are.
So, are there any questions with regard to this, or comments that you want to make? I mean, we're looking at it from a fiscal standpoint at this point. Obviously, there are still issues associated with negotiating with TVA in terms of what the opportunities are and what the constraints are in terms of how that could affect costs and how it could affect flows. But ultimately, preliminarily, this is some of the results that we're seeing, is that there is a system that can be connected to this work.
In other words, our key question when we enter this is transmission from a technical point of view enough, or do we have an issue? What we found out from here is enough. So, barring any contractual limitations, you could import your power from Mexico.
Okay, if there are no questions, then we're going to go to the breakout session. And how did I lose them? Okay, how did I do that? There are 6 questions. There we go. All right, so let's see, is it from Doug over will be one group, and they'll be in the first room out here, right? And then from Mark over would be the second group, and they'll be in the second breakout room, going out into the right. And what we're going to ask you to do is to answer 6 questions in about a half an hour and reach consensus. Now, all we're asking really is that there are a number of recommended scenarios that we presented to you today and some optional sensitivity studies. What we'd like you to do is to rank them from 5 as most important, need to do, down to 1, not needed, and reach some sort of general consensus on this. And I would say you can do that with all of them on one page. You don't have to do the recommended, the first 3, and then the optional sensitivities. But if you go back to basically this list, basically what we'd like you to do is to go down the list and say, is it a 5, a must do? Is it a 4, 3, 2, or 1? Meaning, we'd like to see the ones that you think are the most important to do and just simply rank them. So hopefully you've all got one page of this that you can look at. The second thing we want you to do is, I'll get there eventually. Is, are you comfortable with the direction of the scenarios? Remember the slide that basically says, the one I just showed you, if you look at the directions associated with relative to the base case, do you think that those scenarios are properly characterized? Does it make sense to you that load will go down in some and gas prices will go up and those kinds of things? Does the order or the explanation associated with those cases make sense? Again, 5 is yes, it makes sense to me. 3, I'm not quite so sure. 1, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. You should get rid of it. The next one would be, are you comfortable with the ranges on the stochastic bands? So those are the on the graphs, basically the stuff that are
highlighted in color, and the lines basically representing an appropriate range of uncertainty. So often in the integrated resource plan, I see things where they're pushing sensitivities plus or minus 5%. And history would say that it's going up by 100%. And so we want to make sure that when we're capturing those lines, we're capturing a wide enough band of uncertainty, and you think that there are appropriate bands for consideration of the limits associated with the study. The next one is the list of generation options. We've given you a list in the table. We've given you a lot of detail, probably more detail than you need at this point. But are we missing any technologies that you think need to be considered? And if so, what would they be? List them. And finally, are we thinking about the transmission options appropriately? Are there other things that we should be factoring into the analysis that we aren't considering now? And by the way, just on a separate page, there were a couple of suggestions that we already heard today that maybe we should be considered, and I'd list them out on a sheet of paper as well. So ultimately, what we'd like to do is give you a half an hour. So it's almost 10 after. Come back in here with your easels to give us some answers to those questions. It can be just, if you can't get a consensus, put 3 to 4, that'd be fine. But at least it will give us some sort of an order on what we think is most important with the analysis we have to do.
Yeah. So once again, Doug, raise your hand. Everybody, that's the middle point. So this side is one group, the other side is another group. This is a great opportunity for the PSAT to have input. And it's designed around the PSAT committee having input. Those of you who are visitors, you're welcome to observe, but it's really designed for the PSAT to have input. So the breakout rooms are led by Ben and so go to your breakout rooms. You have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes each. There's 6 questions. Just the high points for each one. You want to go first?
Okay, so I was in the second breakout room to go over our results. So for the first question, we put the first and second questions together and we rated each of the options. So for the no inflation scenario, we gave that a 5. The climate crisis, we gave that a 4. High tech, we gave it a 3. High regulation, we gave it a 3. For the base case, we gave that a 4. And for the worst best, we gave that a 2. Let's see.
So no inflation is the most important.
Yes, that's one of the most important ones for us. Yes.
Maybe we should just go over that because there's quite a difference in some of these between the two groups. So maybe we can actually see where you agree and where the differences are. Okay.
All right, I've got a question. Can everybody hear me?
No.
Okay, we do have quite a difference. We gave the no inflation a score of 1. In other words, not really very important, because we thought that's really not going to happen. And the base case is probably close enough. And so the base case, we obviously considered that as important for any good analysis. We have to have a base case. And then high tech and high regulation. and the climate crisis. We considered all of those to be important for various reasons, all the similarities between all of them, and we see all of them as having a possibility and therefore being worthy of serious analysis. We had some discussion about the worst historical and best historical, and really thought we don't need to worry about the best historical. I mean, planning over time and adaptation, you know, you can accommodate that if that actually comes to pass. But you do want to plan for the worst historical, so that was not as important as the other ones, so we gave that a 3. And the MISO changes, we sort of flipped that around and said, what do we know and what do we want to know and what's really the thing here? And it relates to the interconnection, and is TVA going to allow us to do that? And that was the most serious concern with relation to the MISO changes. So we sort of renamed that one and gave it a 4.
I guess we can move on to letter number C. Are you comfortable with the direction of the key variables relative to the base case? For each case, 5 is very comfortable. We were pretty comfortable with all the key variables. We noted gas. We had gas at 5. Coal, we just said is okay. And CO2 prices, we just said that's okay as well.
We felt like for most of it, we didn't have enough knowledge or really enough time to look into the details of truly understanding the ranges, and so we were satisfied in general about the ranges that were shown in the presentations. But we did discuss the climate crisis and the cost of newer technologies, and we felt like they're not, even if there's an increase in demand for those technologies which would be addressing climate change, there's already work going on in that area, especially batteries, and also in terms of solar technology and wind technology. All that stuff's already underway, so we don't see that even if there's a surge in demand, that the prices will go up and stay up for any period of time. We just see them maybe staying flat for a little while, and then because of all the effort and the demand and the increased efficiency of production, et cetera, that the costs for those technologies will be going down. So we adjust that curve. That was really the only one of all of it that we made any changes to.
I'll speak on letter D as well. We talked about, the question is, are you comfortable with the ranges of the stochastic bands? And we just said that we would trust Siemens with that because we were exactly sure how to study those. Okay. Okay, so we got to letter E, and this is as far as we got. So the question is, are the list of generation options comprehensive? So we said that they are comprehensive except for, we wanted to research nuclear. A large-scale nuclear power plant would be way more than Memphis would need. So we talked about a modular nuclear plant. We just wanted to see a little bit more research in that area. And then one that we just thought would be worth researching, even though I don't believe it's allowed, but we still want to hear more about it, is just using a hydroelectric dam for the Mississippi River.
Maybe not a dam, maybe just a structure.
In case anyone didn't hear that, maybe not a dam, but some kind of hydroelectric structure. Is that Jim?
We also, in looking at generation options, we also listed a hydro option. It had been mentioned in a previous meeting, and some concerns about debris and such in the Mississippi River and whatever. But we still thought, because of the Mississippi River and all the water that's traveling there, at least it's worthy of to be looked at. The other thing we suggested, is there a possibility, maybe not, but at least maybe to look at geothermal, both for new residential and commercial construction. Is there enough opportunity, enough going on, enough money to be saved there, enough improvements in that technology? Is that something worthy? And will it really affect the analysis in the IRP, or is it just a little itch on your cheek. And then microgrids, is there an opportunity not just to save money, but to improve resilience and efficiency of the network and performance and reliability by having microgrids? So is that worthy of consideration?
So that's all we got to. If you got to the last one, feel free to speak on it. Okay. All right, I think that's it.
Thanks again, I appreciate that, and I think that this is all going to be some very good information for Siemens as they prep for our next session. Again, I want to reiterate thank you for being here today, and really for pouring in and providing a lot of good interaction and making us scratch our heads and think about what we need to be doing, and so I want to thank you all for that. As a reminder, the two things. One, don't forget to take your books with you. Number two, the next PSAT meeting is going to be at the Ben Hooks Library, and I think it's October 16th. Where's Frank? 17th. October 17th, same time, but it's at the Ben Hooks Library. Subsequent to that, in November, there will be a community meeting. There won't be a PSAT meeting in November, but the PSAT meeting, next one is October 17th, Ben Hooks Library. Community meeting is on November 21st. I cannot remember where that's going to be, but we'll update you all in the community on that as well. Anything else that we need to cover? I know if you've got to step out, apologize for running over just a little bit. Dennis has one quick announcement I know he's got to make.
The Sierra Club has a presentation and demonstration of electric cars this Thursday at the main library on Poplar Avenue, 6 o'clock in the evening, 3035.
Okay. All right. Same location, I guess, is where we'll be meeting for the next PSAT. Okay. Anything else that we need to?
One question about the community involvement. I guess from the last outreach piece, there were only 40 participants. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I guess the question that we had is that, is there an opportunity to let the public know we're working with this more so than we have been in terms of flyer, or is that even a good idea or a bad idea?
Yeah, Gail's team has done, I think, a really good job of letting the general public know through a number of channels. But certainly we can ramp that up. That's in her shop. But we will continue to keep our foot on the gas to make sure that it's, that folks are aware, and, we realize that folks are busy and things are happening, but not at all a problem. We'll continue to make sure folks are aware. That's good. That's, again, a reminder, that is the purpose for those meetings, is really to make sure that the community at large has the opportunity to weigh in. And so what we don't want to do is get to the end of this process and have folks feel like they did not have an opportunity to weigh in. So we want to have those community meetings. Maybe one thing we need to think about, Gail, is when we have those, we might need to let the folks know what we got. Now that we got some output, or input, I should say, we need to make sure we let the public know, here's what we heard from you, we'd like to hear more, just to kind of reinforce that. So I think that's really important. Thank you for that, bringing that up, Richard. Yes, sir. Commissioner.
How are we doing this? Where are the meetings being held? Is it centrally located for people to get to, or are we setting those meetings up to?
Yes.
If there's a logistical problem, so we can.
Right, so we're I think they're scheduled to be moved around. The first one that we only had one, that first one I believe was held at which community center? The Hollywood Community Center. So it'll probably Hickory Hill, the next one. Okay, well, we'll make sure.
I'll make sure that you
Maybe we need to do like town hall meetings, you know what I'm saying? Have a series.
Well, so again, we've got, and that we've coordinated this with Siemens because they're at the meetings as well, making sure that they're taking the input and integrating that input into this process. So there's a bit of a method to the madness, but again, we've we're gonna continue to make sure folks know when and where those meetings will be. We try to do them in evenings. Again, it's probably gonna be next to impossible to get it to everyone, but I know they're pumping it on social media, doing radio, doing, print. Yeah, they've done a lot of it.
Everything that we've done, we can see how massive our communication has been. But it's just made up 2 cents. The only thing that I learned is that a lot of times people don't see. A lot of times people don't see the communications until the time of need. If it impacts them or something they're interested in, then they see it. And just give you an example about the 3.0 campaign. That group, they did all kind of communications regarding their meetings, trying to get input and stuff. But people only showed up at the end, and that's what a concern I have about this, is by the time we get to making an actual recommendation, that's when I think a lot of people will show up after we've done all of these meetings, all these communications and stuff, and people are gonna show up at the end saying, well, we didn't know this, we didn't know that, but believe me, Total Communications is gonna have a list of everything, a book of everything, all the communication we've done. But, you know, that's how people are, and I'm not criticizing them, but people tend to be interested at the time, it's best for them, so.
Good deal. Thanks. Anything else? We got any other questions? Again, thanks for your input. We appreciate you being here. Everybody be safe. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.